If you value Lakeland Public Television's online content, please consider making a tax-deductible donation at lptv.org. Thank you. In 1863, the Pembina and Red Lake bands of the Chippewa were summoned by Senator Alexander Ramsey to Hewitt, Minnesota, to negotiate what became known as the Old Crossing Treaty. Ramsey's purpose was to acquire land, though he told the Indian chiefs that the Great Father had no special desire to get possession of their lands. He also said, "We do not care much about the land." Yet he told Congress afterwards of the soil being extraordinarily fertile. He also came with Gatling guns, because this was right after, just 10 months after, the largest mass execution in US history in Mankato, when Dakota people who had been involved in the uprising against the US government were hanged. Now, of course, the fact of the matter is that Mr. Ramsey told the gathered chiefs at Old Crossing that the Dakota had broken the terms of its treaty with the US, but in fact the US had broken the terms of its treaty and had not provided food for them, and they were in fact starving. So the whole situation was very much misrepresented. But that was the situation that happened in Hewitt, Minnesota, when all of these people gathered. And of course, there came the Red Lake Band, the Pembina Band, and a contingent of French Canadians known as Métis people came as well. So there were a number of people gathered there, about 1,600 people in fact, about 1,000 Indian peoples and about 600 Métis people who were had been gathered there for this treaty. And what we want to do today is really to discuss how we feel about that treaty, what that treaty means to the people that we know or at least are related to us in that sense, and that we're there. And that's what I'm hoping we can discuss that today and try and understand what the meaning of that is. And today, of course, I have with me to my left Chairman Floyd Jourdain Jr. Thank you so much for coming. We appreciate it, from the Red Lake Nation. And then Mrs. Candace Simar, opposite me here, and appreciate you coming, Candace. Thank you so much for coming. It's very much appreciated. Of course, Candace, you're the author of a number of books about this time period, and that is what is going to be helpful to us, I believe, in understanding how some of the settlers and were feeling as they came into that area. You have relatives who were involved in some of those times. And then to my right, of course, I have Professor Virgil Benoit, and a French-Canadian background, and we really appreciate the wisdom you can bring us about the French Canadians and how they felt in that time. And we're hoping you can also tell us a little bit about how how you feel that the Métis people felt at that time. So I guess we should let the feast begin and just begin to try and discuss how we feel and what the feelings are. And perhaps I'm going to ask Chairman Jourdain to start us off.
Well, thank you for having me on behalf of the Red Lake people. It's always an interesting topic. I know with our background and our chiefs and our history at Red Lake, a lot of our stories and traditions are passed down orally. We don't have a lot of authors or people who recorded those times and passed them down that way, but they've been passed down through the lineage of the chiefs themselves, through leaders throughout time, and of course on to the children and through traditional stories and teachings and accounts. With the old crossing and any other treaty that we entered into, it's always been a bitter pill for the Red Lake Band, to the treaty era and ultimately agreements that ensued. And we've always not really cared for treaties because we have a great respect for the United States. Throughout our history, our band members have served in the military. They've sworn allegiance to the Americas and also the state of Minnesota since it came to be. So we're tri-citizens. But we've also held true, to the allegiance to our own people and passed on the traditions and teachings. And part of them was that the land was very, very sacred to us. And we protect it and maintain it at all costs. And every treaty and agreement that we've entered into, we've all felt like we really didn't have a choice. We had to give up something. And our reality, past the stories that were passed down to us, is that the tribes never wanted to cede territories. And they felt that they really did not have a choice because they were based in reality. We're always looking to the future. Now, in this day and age with modern tribal leaders, a lot of times they're not grounded in their history. They're not well versed in the agreements and the treaties, or simply disconnected either through assimilation or policies, education systems over time. They've forgotten some of those teachings and stories. But they know how to run a good casino, and they know how to get federal appropriations and money and housing and those kind of things. So I think with Red Lake, we've always tried to ingrain in our people that we have to remember what our chiefs and our ancestors went through. Those were hard times for our people because there was a lot of fear. We know what the government wanted. They wanted our lands and they wanted our territories. And so they assembled at Huat, basically with the understanding is that we're going to be negotiating away something. There is no way out of it, and they're not going to go away. And that's a fear that modern tribal leaders have no idea. I speak about this at our annual celebration every summer on July 6th, commemorating the 1889 agreement and Red Lake rejecting allotment. That in this day and age, we don't know the meaning of pressure. We're dealing with the most powerful force on the planet. And when they want something, they're going to get it. And that was the reality of our chiefs, is they knew that we, in order to protect what we have, in order to look out for those little ones who are yet unborn, for the generations yet to come, we're going to have to give them something. There's no way we're going to leave there without that. And they were right. When they did show up there, the military force was there, just like they anticipated. They knew what was going on with the other tribes. Indigenous Anishinaabe people were very smart. They were very advanced in their thinking and their politics and their communications. They knew what was going on in other parts of the state and other parts of the country. Mm-hmm. And it's only a matter of time before whatever befalls one tribe will befall us. It's even that way today. So I think they went there with an understanding that we have to preserve whatever it is that we can for our future generations. And there's really no way out of it. And I remember watching this modern movie called Dances with Wolves, where this old man's sitting in a teepee and he pulls out this blanket and he opens it up and there's a Spaniard helmet. And he said, the elders told us that one day they're going to come like the stars. And he's showing the Spaniard helmet to these people in this lodge. And he was talking about the cavalry and the push west and the thirst for Indian lands. And he said, now this is coming to pass. That's the way the Indians used to think. And Red Lake has always maintained all leadership throughout, from the chiefs all the way into modern times, is that we're not that stupid that we're going to go to war with the U.S. government. That ain't going to happen. We're smarter than that. We have to look out for our people. We have to look out for our future. We have to protect those that are yet unborn. We have a responsibility to do that. So we're not going to put our people in harm's way. We can't do that. That's irresponsible. So they were very, very brilliant, strategic political thinkers, and they had a very in tune with nature and the land and the elements. And later, when we ceded other territories that the government and settlers thought were worthless, we held them valuable because they were a gift from the Creator. Because you can't farm it, that doesn't mean it's worthless. You know, there's plants, there's animals, there's gifts, there's spirits associated with that, and they were so in tune with nature and the surroundings that imagine having to give up something that is so sacred to you, that you're considered a gift from the Creator. So there's a piece too that is not told in the books and that the Indians talk about. They said they had ceremonies and they prayed about these things. And they talked amongst themselves, not only the men, but the ladies. And they didn't have a watch. Well, this is going to take us 7 hours to deliberate this. Sometimes it would take days. And after they did these ceremonies, they talked and everybody had their input. Then they would get together and they would talk to the chiefs, and the chiefs would say, okay, well, this is collectively everything that everybody's talked about here. You know, we value that input, and it's helping us in the decisions that we need to make. So when they would meet with government officials or commissioners or the governor and all those people, all of that was factored in. So I know I'm going on a little longer than I probably should. I know I'm not teaching a class here, but just trying to relay what they were thinking is really difficult to do through oral traditions. Because pretty much everything I know was told to me by older people. And they said, I learned this from my grandpa. And I remember sitting and listening to these old people talk about this. And now I'm telling you about what they were thinking. You know, so when we commemorated the old crossing on October 2nd, that's one of the things we were trying to establish was what were the Indians thinking, and what was the pressures they were feeling, and it was so hard for them to let go, but they were also mindful that they had to, and they were not thinking about the day or for themselves. They were also thinking about the future, and also how do you maintain a relationship with another government? In all reality, you have to work with your neighbors. And you have to coexist. And how are we going to coexist from this point on? Life has changed forever. Now we have neighbors and people all around us. How are we going to interact and survive? And are they coming back again? And they did. Time and time again. Until we have a land base now that's diminished. Other tribes in the country think we have a lot of land. We had land all the way into North Dakota and into Canada. You know, we had a huge portion of northwestern Minnesota was the Red Lake and Pembina bands. So I think in a nutshell, that's basically all I will share with you at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it, and appreciate that, because I think that helps us to understand. And I think, my desire in us sitting down to eat together today is to understand and try and comprehend what was going on at that point in history, and to try and understand how each of those individual groups of people that were represented were actually feeling. And of course, that's we kind of are reliant on oral tradition to some extent to get there. I mean, I think even in the on looking at some of the other people groups, there's things that are written down, but there's still, nevertheless, we're looking at something that's been passed down to us. So we're trying to reach into something that sometimes it takes a little to get a hold of it. I mean, I've been working on this for a little bit, and I don't think I've got a hold of it yet, but I'm working on it. And I know, Candace, you've written about the time period, and I would love to hear what your thoughts are as we start to eat a little bit here.
Well, I appreciate what Mr. Chairman said about the pressures that your people were facing at the time of the treaties, because my expertise or my research has been mainly in the 1862 Dakota War. And when one considers that the Dakotas were expelled from Minnesota completely at the end of the war, and then immediately the treaties were pushed upon the Ojibwa. The Civil War was going strong in the South. The tides were turning for the Union at that time. They had just defeated the Dakota, and yes, that's definite pressure. That if a tribe would protest, maybe their fate would be the same.
Mm-hmm.
That was a very real possibility, I think. I thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you had a relative who was...
I had a great-grandfather who drove the stagecoach at the tail end of the Civil War. And he drove the stagecoach from Fort Snelling to St. Cloud to Fort Abercrombie, which was south of Fargo, or which is south of Fargo. And that's what really stirred my interest in the time period. I was very surprised that I had any ancestors who came that early, but I did have that one great-grandfather that came early. And
What were their feelings? I mean, looking back, it's very interesting to me to understand what motivated them to want to leave Scandinavia and come the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. What, I know you've kind of
can tell
thought
you my
about that.
family story.
Yes, yeah, I'd love to hear that. Yeah.
basically desperation. At the time, the farms were very small. Norway was one of the poorest countries in Europe. At the time when my relatives came, the going wage for a laborer was 5 cents a day. My great-grandmother was an indentured servant, and I don't know for certain that these were her wages, but it was common for an indentured servant.
Sorry, I'm not giving you the other one. So
Oh,
I was all up until research.
so I moved.
This is
Is that a lot of money back then, 5 cents?
No,
Wonder what that was in American.
yeah, I
5
don't
cents?
know.
American?
5 cents a day for a laborer, and the indentured servants would get room and board, Christmas Day off, and a new dress every year, and that was the entire wage package. So if a person was of a poor family, like my family was, there was no hope you could ever have your own place. There was no opportunity. There was nothing. The small farms were given to the oldest son, and so the second-born sons, which my great-grandfather was, he faced a life of being a servant or a hired man or leaving and starting some other place. And so they used all their resources to get here, and once they got here, even if they would have wanted to go back due to perhaps seeing that things were not as portrayed, where could they go? They had no money. They were just starting over. So it was complex.
Do you think that many people who came like your relatives, do you think they were disappointed when they came here? I mean, were they sold a picture of life here that was different than it actually was?
I think it was much more difficult than they ever dreamed. To start with nothing at all, no family, no one to help you, no one to turn to. It was very difficult.
And in your research, have you, I know you've written in your books about the interaction with the Ojibwe people, with the Dakota people as well, the characters in your book. And I'm kind of curious about how, you perceive that your ancestors might have even felt about some of the things that were going on, because a lot of these things that were going on that we've just talked about were almost, I mean, the poor immigrant had not very much to do with the US military or any of these things that were going on. They were players in, or pawns sometimes, in a much bigger picture, weren't they? And I'm curious if there's any sense of what people felt about that, any of that. Did they know? I mean, did it seem unjust to them, do you think?
I know my great-grandfather driving the stagecoach always was reported to have been very sympathetic to the Native Americans.
Thank you.
But that's third hand.
Well, but it does tell us something about, because we don't, without knowing that in the way you've told us, this is how that's how I learn anyway, by being
I was surprised when we visited Norway in 2004 to learn that Scandinavians have not always treated their indigenous people well either. The Sami living in the north, nomadic people, were very persecuted and mistreated. And that has changed in recent decades, but so it was not uncommon for people to have that prejudice for whatever reason, people who are different than them. Mm-hmm.
Do you have any insight about why that might be, Virgil? Why would that be? Why would it be that civilized nations, otherwise civilized nations, somehow didn't bring some of that civilization to bear when they encountered the indigenous people here in North America?
Well, it's partly associated with the term civilization, which really means cityness. Okay. Cityness, as opposed to countryness. And you can go far back into history and the stories we have of people traveling. When they reach out from the city and into the countryside, there is always a bias. And they feel that if they have experienced the life of the city, that they are somehow, and you'll grasp it right away, the sense of it, civilized. And the word carries with it a certain prejudice, a bias already, in favor of what it means to be from the city. So that when our ancestors come to North America, you talk about the uncitied. In English, that becomes, in other words, the uncivilized. But one must understand that not as a hostile statement necessarily. It certainly can become that, especially when you turn to modern uses of the words, like the people who live in the uncitied are savages. And of course, words are changing all the time, and the word savage in the films of the 60s and 50s was terrible. Now, really, the origin of that is based on the bias between the city and the country life. And this exists just not in North American experience, but in the Roman language, the Latin language. If you went to the country, you went to meet the pagans. And pagan is a word for countryside. It's the same root. So those who were not believers in the city system, or what was becoming powerful in the cities, and at one point it was the Christian church, then you were equivalent of being uncivilized. And in this case, it was unchurched. And so there's been this talk between the city and the countryside. And the big theme, one of the big themes in North American literature and stories, in our civilization is the concept of the wilderness. And that brings us back to these prejudices between those who are educated in the city and frequently those who brought the sense of treaties and what they should, the next step after treaty was a territory, and after a territory you had a state. These ideas were moving and assured that they would get into place by people who were carrying the knowledge of how you did that. And so when Ramsay comes to Old Crossing, Ramsay is part of a group that knows full well what it's doing from one step to the next. You go from a wilderness to a territory to a state.
But he actually in the course of his discourse with them, he actually refers to the Ojibwe people as savages. He uses that terminology.
Well, yes, but the word itself means different things through time. I mean, once movies come around and you see what it means to the word visualize as savage, it's not that happy a term. It wasn't happy for Ramsay's time either for most people, but...
Well, even George Washington called indigenous people savage beasts. So used in that context, savage and beast together, does that mean a wild person or somebody who's uncivilized? I think it carried that tonation from way back in the new colonies and people coming over and referencing indigenous people. It wasn't like a misunderstanding or misinterpretation or a literal, but yeah, everybody knew what they meant when they called us savages, wild beasts and people who were not on the same intellect as the more civilized people.
And that's a tremendous disadvantage for a civilization to be thrust into the consideration of those who would look upon it from the outside as to whether or not those people are even human. And so people who study these matters are totally in agreement with what is said here. And your character in your novel is very much perplexed by these major questions, whether or not blacks or native peoples are even human. And civilizations in Europe dealt with that for centuries. And when they came to the wilderness, what an advantage to consider you were not dealing with human beings. And so you've got to overcome all that. But the situation is much better today than it was in terms of trying to work with diversity. And we have authors who create characters who are a little more complex than some of those that just overwhelmed and overrode through whatever power and thinking they had at their disposition. But anyway, that's some reflection.
Thank you, that's helpful. I think that, go ahead.
To dehumanize somebody makes it a heck of a lot easier to take their lands.
Right.
If they don't have the value and they're seen in a lesser light than other people, I suppose, then that justifies the actions of governments. And you're right, it's happened all over the world, in South Africa, and the Aborigines, and the devaluing of people of color over time. They don't understand any of this stuff. They don't value the land. Even John Locke talked about this. He said, everything has to have value. And if you're not taking advantage of the land the way God intended for it to be used, then you don't deserve to have the land. Because God wants us to reap this land, and He wants the fruits to go to the people. And if this is being laid to waste, these people who are in possession of these territories have no right to it, because God believes this land should be used for the betterment of the people. So we're right by taking these lands from these indigenous people, because they don't know how to use it. There's no value in it. They don't value it. See, that's the part where on the flip side you look at indigenous people. You know, they valued something as simple as a small brook, a rock, a frog, and there was total value in everything. So they contradict one another, and I think that's where indigenous people were just befuddled by the notion that, well, you can take something like that and just put a dollar on it? We don't understand that. That just does not, it just doesn't compute with us that they want this for certain purposes, and it seems to be tied to money somehow. You see a 5 cents an acre. Obviously they didn't want the money, you know, so it wasn't about money for the Red Lake and Pembina bands. You know, that they didn't think in those terms, you know. Right now, if you look at an acre now of farmland in America, and I don't know enough about realty and all of those type of things to, if you can quantify 11 million acres, how much it is worth right now, and not only that, how much was made off of it since 1863. You know, the Anishinaabe Nation, you know, we would all be billionaires. So obviously it wasn't about the money, but it was about the taking of land. So those are some of the things that trying to give a little bit more clarity of the way the Anishinaabe thought.
So it's almost like a different value system was sort of superimposed over the top of the pre-existing value system. So whereas your people valued the land the way it was, there was another value system that came along and said, no, we don't recognize that value system, and now we're just going to superimpose another value system over the top, wasn't it? That's almost what happened, isn't it?
Well, like in the 1889 agreement, there was, you know, we have an area called the ceded lands that's north of our reservation proper. There was a failed experiment up there where they wanted to drain the wetlands and farm it. Well, it was a miserable failure, and the settlers who came in there and attempted to do this, they said, well, forget about it, you know, we just can't do it, and they all left. And the Anishinaabe, they said, well, the Indians can have the land back now. You know, we can't profit off of it. And the Anishinaabe were like, yeah, we'll gladly, you know, hey, we're getting the land back. You know, so to them, it wasn't worthless. It was always a beautiful gift from the Creator, and regardless of what condition or whether you could farm it or whatever, you know, they just had a different way of thinking about the earth, and everybody thought that way at some point. It's not, you know, just like a European indigenous, all nationalities, all nations of the earth all thought the same way at one time. And I think over time it just kind of, with governments and the invention of currency and money, and you didn't have when you attach the dollar to the produce and those kind of things. What's the value in something that's going to spoil after 4 days? No, let's make this little metal coin. There's value in this. We amass as many of those as we possibly can and place value to it. And I think once that happened in Europe, that translated over here, and it kind of guided the thinking process. And it's something that we had never seen. You know, we had little things that we traded too, you know, but it was kind of like a temporary thing. It wasn't like a permanent amass of wealth. That was foreign to us.
Am I right, Virgil, in that when the French people originally came over here, they were they kind of partnered with the Ojibwe people for furs and such like, but they were less interested in land per se, weren't they? The original wave, shall we say. Is that true or not? It seems to me that the case is.
Yeah. Well, I think that if some people have that impression, I think you have to go back and look at the circumstances. If you're getting that impression because you compare, let's say, what the people of New France did, later on, New France disappears as a power. And eventually that territory will become Canada. And a certain heritage from New France is continued through French-Canadian sense of continuity and changes with life to some degree. And I'm talking about sense of responsibility towards the land, towards the neighbors. The French-Canadians inherited that. Now, if we go back, inherited what New France had, if we go back to New France and we say it looks like, when we observe New France, that it was less aggressive in its relationships with the native peoples, there's a number of things we have to remember. New France was founded for the purpose of exploiting the New World, when they started with fish off the East Coast, and then they continued with furs mainly. And propagation of the faith. Missionaries were sent over. They perhaps softened some of the cruelties of an economic system that would have gone wild, perhaps, because they insisted that people not be taken advantage of by virtue of what you could trade to get what they had. And they especially addressed the liquor issue and the role it was playing in contaminating civilization that they saw was worth a lot more than what you would see as a result of contamination through bad practices and so forth. So let's dispel any notions of altruism or essential goodness. There were some factors that made it so it wasn't quite as bad a deal. One of them is that the theological seminaries of France had determined that native peoples had a soul.
Okay.
And so you fought for the salvation of the soul and not for destruction of that body.
Okay.
That was an important factor. And that was decided very, very early. I think it's something like 1615. And when our first really strong colonies that would evolve would start in 1604 and 1608, you can see that 1615 was an early date for determining that we were dealing with people who had souls. That helped a lot. The other thing that helped, ironically, we had a small number of people. If we'd had a larger number of people, who knows what armies we would have put together to achieve what some people would have said was what you wanted to achieve. So I don't believe in romanticizing that, but the reality is that we had less of a cruel impact because we were fewer in numbers, and there's probably the theological issue that played a great role. And there were some humanistic people, we call them missionaries, who had a certain good sense that, along with perhaps other settling down of the excitement of the period or whatever it was, we didn't push because we didn't have the numbers to do that. And later on, we didn't have, when it comes to treaties and so forth, and we didn't enter into treaties because we weren't a government. We weren't a government. We were a culture. And we are a government if you consider us as part of Canada, which we must do. If you look at Canada and its makeup, French Canadians are a part of that. They were also a culture. And when treaties were made and difficult situations were handled with the native peoples, one has to look seriously at what has been the buffering factors in Canada and see if the French Canadians had anything intelligent to say or do. And once in a while, there was a small percentage that did. I'm being ironic. It was maybe more than a small percentage at times. But I remember in the parishes that I've studied, not far from here along the Red River Valley, that during the Louis Riel period, when the Métis people, who were so close in heritage to the native peoples of Canada, when they were being treated the way they were being treated by the army from Eastern Canada, and Louis Riel was executed, we had French Canadians from Western Canada come into the parishes in the 1880s and talk in favor of Louis Riel and the fact of how difficult the treatment of native peoples, especially through the voice of the Métis people, was. And so there have been periods of time when we took a strong position that was a little bit enlightened, above and beyond what one might expect would be the routine out of a civilization that was European, that was so totally different from what you look at. If you're talking about local documents, when you look at the writings of the conversations, and so to speak, the translations, for whatever they can represent, being translations, but that's all we've got. But if you look at those translations that the Secretary of the Treaty, Secretary de Ramsey, wrote down, that's probably one of the most fascinating pieces of literature that you could read in Minnesota and probably across the country, because it captures so much an entirely different civilization in its relationship to the physical world, including human beings. But I mean, all the other things that we would just pass over. Christianity was not an ecological movement. No. Well, I've said enough now.
Thank you.
I've often wondered what would we do if someone from a different place and culture came to us and offered us, what if they offered us $1 million for the air above our house? You know, maybe we'd take them up on it because we can't comprehend the air being taken. You know, you think of the cultural differences, and then what would happen if they could take the air above our house? You know, I think a lot of the cultural differences really affected.
And if they really could, we wouldn't be able to breathe after a while.
Right.
And I mean, and I think that's how your people felt, wasn't it?
Well, a lot of it was new. There was some pretty educated thinkers back then too. You know, there was it was industrial times, and it's not like we were walking around everybody wearing furs. You know, there was people were pretty in tune with what was happening in the world. Had a lot of good friends and intermarried with the French, and there was things going on then. So I think it's like a transition period where they're looking at the future and how is this going to play out when we're gone. So in these treaties and agreements, you see references to education. They wanted to know what was happening. They wanted to know how to prepare for the future, and the ones that were coming after them, hopefully they would have the tools and the wherewithal to be able to navigate through life and coexist with other cultures and other people. And the key to that has always been education. Farming, a lot of these treaties and agreements from that area, the leaders said, well, we want to know how to compete. Whether or not that'd be making money. We want to be able to educate our children. We want to keep everybody happy and safe and do all those things. So some of those discussions they talked about was adapting. How do we adapt to the changing times now? You know, it's obvious that we can't just stay in a shell and be the way it's always been. We have people come in here that we know who are learning our language, and we want to learn their language. There's always been this big language barrier, and that's one of the things I hear our band members talk about is that, well, what did the Indians talk about in the Ojibwe language? How was that interpreted? And there was this mistrust, even on the part of band members and people who negotiated on behalf of tribes. Their relatives today. So, well, that was my great-great-grandpa or whoever who helped negotiate, and he was an interpreter and this and that. And then you have like other natives who say, well, we were misinterpreted. Or how do we know whether or not this person was really taking the Ojibwe language and interpreting it the way that the Indians meant it to be? So when they were talking to these government officials or whatever in English now, well, here, I listen to you. Now I'm going to interpret this to these people. You know, how do we know that it's what got lost in translation? All we see is what's written down in English by some white guy, and we have no real account of what our elders said in Ojibwe, because they didn't write that down. And so the language is a huge, huge piece of that, because in some of these depositions from treaties later on in the, like in the 30s and such, when people came along and they said, well, we want to interview your band members, and some of them have accounts of the 1889 agreement and this and that, and they were there. And the end result of the agreement, they went back and interviewed some of these Indians, and they said, well, that ain't what we meant at all. That ain't what we talked about. But now this agreement is finalized, and now we lost a big chunk of our lake. We never talked about that. That's not what we agreed to. You know, so there was language speakers, interpreters, and there was people who actually put down what the final end result was. So I think language has a lot to do with it. And there's this mistrust of, you know, they don't really come right out and accuse anybody of anything. But some of the Indians who interpreted and worked on behalf of the band, back then people said, well, how do we know that they really understood what the Indians wanted? Because somewhere along the line we seem to lose so much for, you know, in these negotiations. That's a big question mark. I know there's linguistics and professors of language and all of that, people who maybe at some point can sound in on that part of treaties. I don't know enough about that part of it to really, I can only talk to what some of the people say about the language and how that might have been interpreted.
Right, right. I remember you once said to me that anytime your ancestors went to Washington, D.C. and signed a piece of paper, they came back with less than they started with.
I remember one leader saying they call us the dumb Indians, and this was other tribes, Red Lake. So, well, we're dumb like foxes, and we still have our land, and we don't care what they say about us. Yeah, we didn't wear big fancy suits and hats when we went around. We just wore our regular clothes, and because of that, they made fun of us. Look at those Indians over there. And those are the stubborn ones. They, you know, look at the way they're dressed, and they made fun of us. But we didn't care. You know, we just wanted to do right by our people. We didn't care how we dressed and what we looked like when we, you know. But they were talking about the treaty and especially the agreement era when they would bring the tribes out to D.C. and they'd wine and dine them and buy them fancy clothes, and they'd do these photo shoots with all of the tribes. And some of our people did that too. But it took away I think a lot of the power of negotiation, because now you don't have 300 Indians to answer to. You have a small group of people, 3,000 miles, 2,500 miles away from the home base, and they're out there negotiating and doing whatever. So I think a lot of times that's what they're talking about, these old stories that they pass on. And then that's one I know in Red Lake, they said, well, there's even other tribes that used to make fun of us because we didn't conform, I suppose, to what tribes are supposed to be doing. You know, we didn't cave, I suppose.
Looking at the future now, though, I mean, we've obviously, all of this history has happened, and we're now seated, you know, where we are in history right now. But we still have to live with the effects of all that's been done, the good and the bad. And yet somehow we have to find a way to live together and to find a way forward. I think one of the things that spoke to me very much at the memorial of the signing of the treaty, the way that you put it was that our people have given this gift of 11 million acres to the United States, and that was I was very interested that you put it that way.
Well, it is a gift, and it is you're conceding some things, and you're accepting the fact that we have to coexist, and then we have done that. But I think part of it too is a big piece that I've heard talked about over the last, or especially the last couple decades, is historical trauma. And where you get these Indians walking around and they don't even really fully realize that subconsciously somewhere they're harboring some sort of resentments against white people. And a lot of them don't even know why. They just know that, hey, we've been screwed over, and I don't like white people because of that. And they, you know, they don't even fully understand it. And they carry this with them. One of the things I spoke to at the Old Crossing Treaty was closure and healing. At some point in people's lives, when they experience, I suppose, a reoccurring something that's keeping them suspended in a state of resentment, or something's going on they don't fully understand. A lot of times there's some sort of traumatic event that has happened in their lives that they just haven't had an opportunity to address it head on. And we're hoping that by education and understanding of, just like today, both, you know, the Europeans, that's new to me. You know, making 5 cents an acre and living an existence where there's very little hope, and you're told, just like the Irish, come to America, come to Oklahoma. There's a beautiful paradise here where you can build a life and you can have a farm, and if you can get here sooner than your counterparts, the Oklahoma Sooners, you stake a claim to that land, you can live your dreams. You can have your own piece of land here in America. And when they came, they didn't know part of the deal was, in order for you to have these lands, you need to get rid of those Indians that are there. A lot of these Irish immigrants said, well, we just escaped persecution. For you to tell us to come over here, that we have to come over here and exterminate these people who lived here prior? We just try to get away from that. And what American history doesn't tell you is that there was tons of Irish immigrants that went back. They said, we refuse to participate in something like that. We didn't come here to sign up for that. We're not going to exterminate anybody. But there was a lot of them who came into those territories, and they came with big dreams, and they saw the American dream, and they came. And that's the part that Oklahoma Indians tell me, that, you know what, that's the part of American history you don't read in the history books, is that we were chased off of out of our territories and ran off these lands. But it's just part of the expansion of America. So those are traumatic events, you know, with the relocations and all those things that happened with a lot of those territories over there, that those natives, you know, there's 1 million Indians in Oklahoma. They said, you know, we carry that trauma as well. And we have to find a way to get over that. We have to find a way, and the key that we see is education. So if we can tell our own story from our own perspective and just let people see what it is, and they can look at it and they can say, oh, well, now at least I know what happened to me. Maybe now I can move on, and I can put what's been festering in me behind me. So a lot of these historical trauma issues tied to treaties and agreements, those continue to be, but not only with Native people, but also on the other side, an American education system. You know, it's, you know, I had a guy here tell me he went out to Louisville to watch the Lady Cardinals. There's 2 Native American girls who play Division I basketball. He said he must have stopped at 4 or 5 Walmarts on the way out there. He said, and every single one, I stopped at the door, and there's no one to check my purchase? He said, and it just dawned on me that I've been all over the country. The only place they have people checking at the door is in Bemidji, Minnesota. Nowhere else in America. It just dawned on me that So this is the only place they do this? Where I live? Surrounded by 3 big Indian reservations? He said that was really, oh, okay, I can go. Isn't that song?
Yeah, that's,
You know, so I said, you know what, I never really thought about that. Come to think of it, I was in Thief River about 2 weeks ago, and they didn't have a door checker there either.
wow.
So, but there's one here in Bemidji. Go there today, you'll see them sitting there.
Yeah, that's true, there is.
You know, when we were in Norway, we went to a museum and we saw a poster there. And we just still laugh about it because the poster said, "Come to Minnesota, empty land, hardly a stone to pick," and then the last line, "no mosquitoes."
Why they got that one wrong?
Yeah, they needed truth in advertising back then. But there was a real push to get people over. And you think of the Homestead Act of 1862 and what that played in even the treaties, trying to push open more lands. Yeah, it's real interesting, all the forces working together.
That certainly makes you think about the, you know, the Homestead Act and the idea that the government was trying to persuade people to come. It kind of it just puts a slightly different twist on it, because you're then saying, well, so who are these people that are actually coming up with this idea that we need to do this? I mean, because evidently the people that are your relatives were encouraged to come because of the advertising, so to say, but the advertising didn't actually tell what it was really going to be like when they got here, and you really wonder if they'd really known what the true situation is, would they have got on the boat? I mean, of course, we don't know the answer to that question, but that then takes you back a stage and say, well, wait a minute, who are these people who are cooking up this scheme? You know, what were the thinkers? Were there thinkers who were, I mean, were there people who were scheming and putting their heads together on some grand scheme and just using everybody as pawns to portray it? I mean, I don't know the answer to that question, but it makes you wonder if that was the case.
I remember taking a class here at BSU one time. They were talking about the civilized tribes of Oklahoma, and how one particular tribe, you know, they had like a cotton gin company, they had a Cherokee Phoenix newspaper, and they did everything that was asked of them in order to become a civilized Indian tribe to avoid relocation west of the Mississippi. And they met every criteria, they did everything, they were educated, they had businesses, and they were doing really well, but they got relocated anyway. So those are some of the things that you kind of question, is civilization really what was the end goal?
Right.
You know, it's they did pretty good. You know, that was a pretty. They had some good things going on over there, but it didn't really.
Even though they did all that they were supposed to do, so to say, if you put it that way, it didn't result that way.
No, it didn't result. They were moved anyway. So
those things make you wonder, though, don't they? I mean, they make me wonder anyway as to just what was going on.
You know, I really appreciate Bishop Henry Whipple. In my research, what little I've done, he seems to be the one that had a sense of justice in Minnesota. It's a real interesting venture to read the newspaper articles, because he wrote scathing letters to the editor about the treaties. And I was looking through a little bit of my research last night, and I found a quote where he said about the Red Lake Treaties, he said, "From beginning to end, fraud." And Bishop Whipple went directly to the president. He was working with Buchanan, and then there was a change of administration. He tried to work with Lincoln, and he was just appalled at the treaties, Minnesota treaties. So he was one person that really tried to work for justice. He's an amazing person. And you were telling me about, you've done research on him also.
Well, I agree with you.
You do have to wonder, though, if it's the case that in the middle of all of this, that there's people who are doing good things and people who are doing bad things in that time as well as this time, and we're dealing with
Not
this
everybody was bad.
problem.
You know, there's a lot of big interests involved and a lot of powerful people on a lot of different levels, and there's a lot of, you know, any way you slice it, there's profits to be made, and there's a lot of pretty big players involved with all of these agreements and treaties, so it was a lot bigger than most people realize.
A couple of comments I have from what I read and think about and try to adjust in listening. It's really exceptional, I think, that a minority or a group reduced to minority status in a country would maintain its courage and sense of itself to establish the importance of continuity, which is in their belief system. So they have a strong system of belief and continuity and confidence. Which, in terms of diversity of a nation, you have to give thanks for that. When it comes to the future, as you mentioned a little earlier, when you look at certain adjustments that have been made, because in modern times, you see, you might think of the treaties as the start of the modern era of the North American experience. One of the things that I find important is that African Americans reached and touched Lincoln so that he decided not to push a policy which he had of encouraging them to think about going to Africa to return, which some of them did do. But they stayed with it until Lincoln was convinced that the Civil War would have to take place to reinstate the African to something that was on the road to some decent life of freedom, at least having some opportunity there. But they were African Americans that were educated to be able to talk to Lincoln. And somehow they got his attention so they could have meetings. This is according to the latest biography of Lincoln. It came out about 2 years ago. I think it's the latest one, where people studied who he was meeting and how he was forming his ideas, because he was not necessarily, he was extremely puzzled by the Civil War. The outcome of it, would it split the nation, and was it worth it? And his first stance was, it isn't worth it, why don't you just leave? They stayed with it, and they knew how to talk to him and persuade him, and he changed his policies. The American Indian has never had that moment, I don't think. They've had a lot of moments, but I don't think they had access to the president at a critical time, and I think that they certainly didn't have it at the time of the Civil War, when the treaties were taking place. What you can hope is that now our nation would have an open ear for another phase of just pursuit, and that not only our highest official would be open to such things, but that the country in general. A lot has been done in the educational system to prepare the way. If you look at the history and programs and what's supported by the state of Minnesota, often is very encouraging in terms of enabling us to try to understand a culture that is a tremendous alternative, a rich alternative to the thing that we assume is just a superior way of life. We have this rich alternative. Now, as you go into this modern era that you mentioned, accommodation of that history is an extremely important theme. And that takes rich negotiators on the side of those who will decide just how much do you want to just set down here in this burden of memory, and how much do you insist that the nation at large remember, so that you're not forgotten in time, in the struggles, in the continuity, and so forth. If the white Americans, and putting them in the same class, which shouldn't do, but if the white Americans generally can say, these are the stories of my ancestors and the hardships of my ancestors, and they repeat that, and they consider that repetition as somehow healthy in the maintenance and the sustenance or the development of a memory of why we did what we did, and we accept that, and even find a certain joy in it. I bought your book so I could have more of it. Really, then what is the narrative? What are the pieces of the narrative of other groups that should not be negotiated away? And we can call that accommodation if you want. But any peoples living through this know that they have to do what I hear people trying to do as they think about the future. But I'm always afraid that we destroy too much of that memory in an effort to give, so that people will say, oh, it's okay now. It isn't okay if you have to forget everything that you've lived. And so we have to, I think, be desirous of hearing what humankind has experienced and not destroying that, because in the bottom line, we are, as you said, Michael, as you have heard the people say, we're people. And part of that dignity is not to forget what our people, various pieces of the pie of people, have lived. That would be a disgrace. So I just hope that we continue to have the development of strong leadership. I work at a university on a campus, and every year I see in the graduating classes people from these minorities that are developing a voice, that they're making literature that we can also purchase, like we're buying yours. And they're establishing law offices, and they're establishing businesses, and they're writing, and they're teaching. And we are not in a generation of darkness anymore. Well, anyway, said enough.
If I can speak to the president. You talked about access to the president and the perceptions of the United States' highest official. The only reference that we've had, well, I know in our band, I don't think there's ever been anyone in the history of our tribe, aside from Roger Jourdain and myself, that have actually had contact with the President of the United States. In our treaties and agreements, the President of the United States is referred to as the Great Father. And he's used in a context where the Great Father will not look kindly on you if you do not agree to these terms. And to have that perception of the most powerful country on the planet as being, you don't want to piss this guy off, that is terrifying. For, you're going to agree to these terms, but if you don't agree to these terms, when you see the reference that the Anishinaabe are talking, they always reference the great mystery. The great mystery of life, and they're referring to all of the spirits, and they're referring to the Creator, and that's our boss, the great mystery. That's our reference for someone, a being or someone that is greater than ourselves, that we rely on for direction, and somebody that we, all of our existence hinges on that. But to have somebody come and say, well, we have the equivalent, the Great Father, that will be the decider here. We have these negotiations, and we have these talks, and we leave here, and if this agreement isn't suitable to the Great Father, then it's not going to be good for you guys. So I think over times in history, you look at the 1889 agreement, Old Crossing, and all of those type of treaties, and now you get this next generation of people reading these treaties and agreements, and they're saying, oh my God, geez, so we had to do this or else? So I think that has progressed over time, where tribes as sovereign entities have basically made some progress in this particular area, where the United States government has said, okay, we get it. We understand that as another nation to another nation, these treaties actually meant something, and you were acknowledged as a government that was established before any Europeans ever existed here, before there was a state of Minnesota, any of this, before there was a Governor Ramsey. You had established your own customs, traditions, your own laws, your own protocols, your own language, all of that. We recognize you as a sovereign, one sovereign to another. So now, we're no longer going to talk down to you in this manner. You are going to be acknowledged as such, and you will be granted the same access as an ambassador of another nation, or the prime minister, and those type of things, because you're not a municipality, you're not a corporation, you're not a state, you're not a business. You actually have the status as another government, just like all the rest of them in the world, that we enter into treaties and agreements and we have protocols with as well. I think that was where tribes finally started to feel accepted as actually sovereign Indian nations then. And they said, you know what, I think they're finally starting to acknowledge our people. And this tribal nations gathering that happens in Washington, D.C., people are like, well, how can the tribal leaders from all across America and some from the First Nations of Canada go there and just sit down just like this and have a face-to-face with the President of the United States? I've been on the city council for 35 years, and I've never even been in the White House. And so we always have to do this sovereignty 101 thing with legislators, with the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council tries to do this with our state legislators. A lot of them are sportsmen's organizations, you name it. All of these people come at us and they say, sovereignty, what's that? That's a myth. I think George Bush even said, we gave sovereignty to the American Indians. And the American Indians said, well, President, that's not totally correct, Mr. President. It existed, prior to all of this stuff. And he goes, oh, yeah, you're right, I'm sorry. So that level of what would you call it, the legitimacy, recognition as a sovereign nation. I think there's a lot of education, again, it comes down to education, educating people, that if I go in to the province of Manitoba, I can't just drive into Manitoba and start doing whatever I want. The Canadian government's going to say, well, I want to see your passport. I want to see, in our case, our tribal ID. And don't you know that 80 on the signs, that doesn't mean 80 miles an hour, Chairman. There's a different set of laws up here. Now you're going to give you a fine. So all of those things, I think, is the lack of legitimacy with tribes. A lot of times those took a long time to build that, So I think it has progressed to some extent. But there was a time with the churches. You talked about Bishop Whipple and Bishop Marty and people who came to our tribe hand in hand with the governments, and they came together and they said, hey tribe, this is what's good for you, and you make this negotiation, and some of it, if you read it, it's fascinating. You think, geez, this is coming directly from the president, at least these people are representing themselves as saying that the president is saying this. And really, if we don't agree to this, then bad things are going to happen to us. So when you go back, we don't have a lot of references other than those treaties that our band members, now students, college students, high school students, people who are doing research papers, they go back and read these treaties and agreements and they say, geez, those are pretty frightening times when you guys agree to this, or else the president's going to authorize us to come back, and it's not going to be good.
Certainly when you read that language of the Great White Father, it sounds to me terribly patronizing language, and yet that language is in all of these documents. I mean, even to U.S. Supreme Court decisions, you've got that similar kind of idea coming through. But to me today, it sounds patronizing, doesn't it? I mean, it doesn't sound the way we would talk today, I don't think, does it?
Well, that's right. I agree with you, and I don't want to lead you to think that I'm thinking otherwise. But I think that was kind of a metaphor, a way of speaking, that the English-speaking population had picked up on, that Native Americans did have a sense of a creator. What happens in a kind of a ideological landslide of ideas is, it seems to me that a person like Ramsey, and there are a lot of them at his time, they are reducing a supreme being that was part of the sense of a creator with the native peoples. They're reducing not to a representative on earth, and that would be the Great White Father in Washington. And that was a terrible landslide of systems of trust and belief in relationship to the world. The one was a social system that Ramsey was proposing that would set in place a new order that you could ride on. The other was a system of a relationship that was evolving but had some continuity, and the circle, of course, remains a symbol for that, that you didn't jerk yourself loose from a time previous, but you were more assimilating life as it happened. The other system said, no, let's start over. You become owners of this land. You give us the first deed, and we go from there, and thereafter everything's on paper, and you can't fight it. It was such a tremendous change in belief system. And gradually, you see, what had to do is it had to shake out in the sense of, let's make that supreme sense of what life is down to something we can put a beard on and a top hat. And we'll call him Lincoln or the Great Father. And thinking that people, and there's where the patronizing comes in, thinking that if you called him by a term that probably was a translation of a term of the great being, the Great Father, who knows? Then all of a sudden, then people would begin to agree with you and say, yes, we do understand. But it's just a tremendous corruption of the belief system. You weren't putting that much faith in one individual. And so the American individualism gets put into place. And today we sort of have a nostalgia, a wish that we could have more of a community-oriented way of life. And so who do we go running to? We come to the native peoples and we say, you hardly ever talk about yourself as individuals. You always, almost by the second sentence, if we ask you how you're doing, you're talking about your tribal experience, your community experience in your life as the continuing entity of the things that make life meaningful and that you relate to over since you remember. And so such a difference, but we do recognize that today in a lot of our studies, that there's a tremendous individualism in white America, and there's a sense of community in some of the minorities, and the major one, of course, is Native Americans. And the black people, African Americans have similar relationships. When you ask them, how is everything going? They won't say, well, I just bought a farm yesterday and I don't know, I might sell it tomorrow, and they're fracking under my house and I'm really going to get rich, except I just read in the contract, the fine print, what you get into my house is not mine. Oh, I'm very disappointed, and it's too bad because otherwise I could buy a trip, to Hawaii for all my children and so on and so forth. They hardly know who the mayor of the town is. And so we do have, and I don't think I'm exaggerating it too much, a tremendous undercurrent of individualism in white America. And then we have a couple of major minorities, African Americans and Native Americans. They're major minorities who speak of the experiences and the values they have that are associated to their community. And now more and more, as the world says, we are a community, well, then the term becomes a little bit more popular than rugged individualism and grab what you can. I don't think we realize to what extent the tycoons, the Rockefellers, and all those people who have holy names today robbed their way into fame. And we admire that. Everything from the Rockefellers to the Carnegies to the Kennedys, beautiful people, admired for a rugged individualism that destroyed a lot for the common people. And they were common in their roots and threw that aside because you could grab. And I'm not saying Native Americans should be idealized, but they were in a different reality that didn't allow them to grab. And probably they would have if they could have. I didn't idealize French Canadians a little while ago, and I don't idealize anybody else. But the fact is that history teaches us some examples and some models. And out of that comes some realities. And out of that comes your teachings. And I think that certain minorities then live to where their teachings out of their experiences are extremely valuable because they've stayed in touch with I don't know if they're permanent things. Not permanent in the sense that if you had written them out, you would be able to say, well, we're still, the dot at the end of that sentence is still the same sentence, and there's still only 5 words. It's an oral tradition, and so it's evolving, but it remains it's such that it continues to give confidence to those people, and that gives confidence to a much wider group. But that confidence is not based on a book and says, this is what it means. And everybody then gets a hold of the book, they form a group, and they say, this is what the book means. There are people who don't live, they live by something other than just a book. And so we're really looking at things that were shocking when they happened. The fact that somebody would come in with a little note paper, and take notes and translate exactly what was being said, and then that became law, and then you were going to hold people to it, or you would bring the army in. What a change in the relationship to what life was meant to be when it was a different creator. And putting into position individuals with supreme authority was just a shocker. I've talked too long on that, made the point several times, and I wanted to express basically the admiration for that which human beings muster up the courage to not forget.
Mm-hmm. I think not forgetting is hugely important here. I mean, one of the things that shocked me as I looked into these things was I had a discussion with a federal Indian law expert, and the question I asked was because when you look at this treaty in particular, I mean, it's clear that Ramsey misrepresented his interest. I mean, he told the chiefs that their land, he wasn't interested in their land, but out of the other side of his mouth, that's exactly what he wanted. And it's on paper. I mean, we don't have to speculate that he did that. We've got the evidence is written before us that he did that. I mean, even his report to Congress afterwards clearly says that he valued the land, and in fact even says that he told the chiefs that it wasn't valuable. So we've got that same situation there. And I asked this expert in federal Indian law if a treaty has been obtained by fraudulent means, is it still valid? And the answer is that the treaty is still valid. It doesn't alter the validity of the treaty, which is shocking. I mean, if you went in downtown today and did a transaction with a merchant and you could then prove that they lied to you, the transaction would be invalid very quickly. But this is not, that's evidently not the case here. That puzzles me a little bit, but apparently that's true.
And it wasn't the first time Ramsey did that, because he had already gone through this whole series of treaties with the Dakota, very similar. So he knew exactly what he was doing.
Yeah, the context, Ramsey is a very sharp negotiator. When he says, we don't want your land, this is very believable at the time. Because really the big push was to get a right-of-way for the ox cart freighting business. And the Ojibwe were insisting, in their own ways, in an irregular manner, I guess, that when the ox carts would go through on an annual basis from about 1842, and it had a brief period there of interruption in the early 1860s because of the affairs with the conflicts and so forth, there were hundreds and hundreds of ox carts that went down through Ojibwe land. And so Ramsey's first statement was, we want to buy a right-of-way. And that was totally understood. And then it escalated. And if you're not interested in giving us a right-of-way, well then maybe you'd be interested in something else. So it's once again, it's a sliding scale there. And it's like getting on the train to Duluth, you know. And you get on the train, if you end up in Duluth, well, you got on the train. And that was a sort of a thing, you know, once you got to Old Crossing, what were you going to do?
And when somebody tells you we want to have a big powwow and a peace treaty, you say, well, wait a second, we're not at war with anybody. Of course, everybody's going to be concerned. And I know the way that, you know, they call it chiefs, but there was people that they assigned for certain things, and you didn't need several hundred people to go and you know, they didn't show up just because they're good listeners. You know, they knew that something was going down, and they were concerned about it, and that's why there were so many Indians there, hundreds of them. You know, they didn't just send a chief and a couple guys to go over there and negotiate something. You know, it was they were concerned, and they were worried, and they knew something was going to take place there, and they were right.
I think that out of conversations like this, I know I really want to thank you very, very much for this, but the other thing is that what people end up repeating is probably, if I go back to this, what you accommodate, a lot of that which gets repeated is what should not be thrust away. And to me, those are the documents of our human experience in North America, and how fortunate we are to still have memories of it, and people who well, I'm not going to patronize, but who are still here.
Well, we are our history. You know, we come from our history, and we need to know our history. We need to understand it. It does not mean we agree with it. It does not mean we approve of it. I've had a lot of people tell me, why do you dig up all that old stuff again? And I just feel very strongly that we need to know what happened, and we shouldn't sugarcoat it. We don't have to, we just need to know what happened. We can't go forward until we understand what has happened.
When you sent me those 3 pages, you know, from Candace's novel, I didn't want to look at them. I was telling Candace that a little earlier. I said, oh my God, we're going to get another romance here, and I can't take another romance on the prairie. And by golly, when I read it, I realized that the main character was grappling with major ideas of justice and humankind, and I was glad to see a European troubled by the realities. And so it's a realistic novel.
I think the part of history too is what Native people are grasping for is they want to have it told also from the perspective of Native people. And that will spark some sort of momentum, because if there's any movement or mobilization or anything that's going to be productive on behalf of people of color, it needs to be held and led by people of color. And you go to any social movement throughout history, it's always been somebody who's led those efforts, and it's been people who represent their own people and told their own story. I read a book one time called Lies My Teacher Told Me. Richard Llewellyn is the author. And he studies like 12 American textbooks that are been authorized for use in American schools. And every single one contradicts the other. They all basically have the same theme. We've started out with nothing. We overcame adversity in the end. We're the shining of example of what the rest of the world should look like. But then you go to another one and they all have the same theme, but they all tell different stories. So it's just like, well, which one is the real story here? If we can't even get our American history right, how the heck are we in a position to be telling the history of Native Americans? Right? We're not. And so I think a lot of Indian people have said, we really need to tell our story. We're not talking about telling the story and bashing white people or bashing America. We just want our perspective and our recollections, because there's a lot of things I talk about today that I didn't read off of a piece of paper. It was taught to me by elders and former tribal leaders and other tribes, and we all have similarities. So I think it's part of that understanding in the education process needs to be told. Not that other authors don't have value. There's a lot of good stuff out there that I've learned from textbooks and throughout the years trying to educate myself on treaties and American history, and I referenced European history. I was thinking, well, I better find out about what happened in Greece, and I better find out about what happened in Europe, and how all of that carried over here. It's like we want to escape prosecution and the injustices, and we want to be free, but then you take the same template, bring it over here, and recreate the same thing. I'm like, well, what's the point in that? Weren't you just trying to escape that? So now you're going to come over here and apply the same methods to people of color over here that you were trying to escape over there, you were saying they were doing to you? That makes no sense to me. So trying to figure out how we fit within all of that is really fascinating to think about. And but our history, I think there needs to be more Native American authors and storytellers,
Very
and
much so.
a lot of our stuff is there's a different mindset now, especially with elder people. It's like it's forbidden to be some of these things are real taboo teachings, different types of cultural and spiritual things. They say that you shouldn't really be putting out there. But I think with a lot of those elders leaving now, they're saying, well, we just don't want to get lost and have it all just disappear. And some of them are giving the blessing to some of the younger ones now and saying, you know what, we don't want to lose our identity and our teachings and a lot of those things that we've passed on. It's even the oral traditions are starting to dissipate. So maybe we need to put some of this stuff down there. Nowadays, you Google sweat lodge, and you look, boom, there's some guy in there showing you how to make a sweat lodge, just like, I think that's what they were afraid of, is just, having your own...
your holy things.
Yeah, your spiritual and religious ceremonial type stuff out there for the whole world. A lot of that stuff is tightly guarded, and it's passed down orally. That's the way it's supposed to be taught that way. You go through that, and it's a life experience. It's not something you can just pick up a textbook and all of a sudden you're the guru of all things Ojibwe. You know, it's just that's traditionally not the way it's supposed to be. So I think, well, I'll end my segment with hopefully that's what's going to happen, is that we're going to see more authors, more Native American historians and storytellers and photographers and what have you, you know, to be able to tell our side as well. And you temper that with what's out there already. I think it'll be a good way of complementing American history with Native American history, so that we can get a better comprehensive look and understanding of how we arrived at where we're at now.
Yeah, the history of the nation and the construction of the history of a nation does not always leave place, nor does it necessarily invite the history of our various communities. Because you're constructing national histories. You're working for the Great Father and the great men, which I'm saying that purposefully to you, that we say made this country. And then all of a sudden women say, well, what was our part in it? And then now you start to alter that history. And before that, Native Americans and African Americans and so forth. So it's certainly in the mind of the nation that most history courses are taught in a desire to contribute to the construction of a national history. And then you say, well, where is our history in that national construction? And that's where what you do is so important. And that's where it's essential for us to realize that when certain people were cut out of the nation, and so to speak, giving some title that was, I don't know how you express this sovereignty thing that you just mentioned. Well, they were sovereign. What were you doing? Taking it back and giving it back to them the next day? And then playing with that after you modified it? So that's where all of a sudden the national thrust to make the country, to put it in such a situation that your rules would be accommodating to those who would come in. There's a lot more to our entire history than national history, which I respect. But it's got to have its place, and it's got to know that it's not omnipresent. In terms of a major study on what people trust, just the general population, but I mean the examples of the population, they based their study on surveys with at least 2,000 people in the United States, as to what do you trust from history and what sources do you trust. And I want to share that here at this moment. The results of that survey was Roy Rosenzweig, The Uses of the Past. It was a major study to see what ways, how people use the past as they made their futures. And it was also asked questions about what do you trust from the past. And this is where I want to perhaps complement something that you mentioned. You say you have more and more people coming out and wanting to speak and so on and so forth. That study ranked the trustworthiness of certain sources from 1 to 10, 10 being the highest. About the lowest you could get was a high school history teacher. The highest you could get was the direct statements from those who had lived the experiences. They were the most believable. Either they were doing it through writing or they were doing it through talking. When it got to be a construction of a film that was manipulated and fictitious, and you could see that, then it was just about as low, if not lower, than high school history teachers. So a lot of things are in your favor, and we're talking about public history. We're not talking about that which would be indiscreet to present. But the relationships between the different groups, the relationship of minority communities with the national politics that we're talking about when we look at treaties and so on and so forth, those are public history issues, and any side can study that. And it's not indiscreet necessarily, unless you make it indiscreet by saying we were involved or we weren't involved in such and such a way because it was of a sacred nature and now we'll tell you about it. That's an indiscretion, I believe, for the people who are volunteering that information. But this history that's documented, this was part of public events, and different sides have the obligation to discuss that. And if the people who have, the more people who experience what that history is, the truer it will become as it is remembered. And so that's where it's so critical and so encouraging that what's happening now is I hate to pronounce, I'm not doing that, but as where I'm from, that's what I see. I'm not creating it at this table.
And I think I would echo the reality of what you say, because I think as I've been studying this subject, the Native voices have been extremely helpful to me. I mean, Dr. Choya's writings and Brenda Child, her writings and hearing her perspective of it has helped me understand it immeasurably. So I think that has personally been a benefit to me. And I think too, you know, the Red Lake Nation's adopting a tribal holiday every year to commemorate this event. I think that is a help. Certainly being, you know, as you allowed me to come and be part of that and to record that was very helpful to me in gaining greater understanding of the whole subject. And I think that will be helpful to other people too in bringing greater understanding. So I want to thank you for that, and I want to thank each one of you for joining us today and for being part of this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
If you value Lakeland Public Television's online content, please consider making a tax-deductible donation at lptv.org. Thank you.